Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Welcome and thank you again for coming to our webinar today, how Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas City broke down their Tprm silos with Shella Gentry, Senior Information Security Analyst, and Brenda, our very own Brenda, is our Vice President of Third-Party Risk. My name's Amanda Farina. I'll be your webinar host today because this is as close as I'm going to get to having my own TV show. And I've just got a couple of things to let you know about before we go ahead with the webinar. First of all, you guys are all muted. We do want to do that to cut out any background noise, especially with many of us in our home offices. We love your dogs, we just don't want to hear them right now. And however, to keep the session interactive, we do ask you and invite you to submit your questions live using the Zoom console on the bottom of your screen. Time permitting, at the end of the hour, we'll address those questions in the Q&A session. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we plan to deliver that recording to your inbox tomorrow morning. And I know you didn't join to hear my voice, even though it's very exciting. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Shella and Brenda. Thank you both so much for joining, ladies. And Brenda, please take it away.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, this was your debut for your
yes,
TV show.
I am. Okay, I'm gonna go mute.
All right, thank you. We'll talk to you soon. Well, thank you, Shella, for joining us today. As you all know, the two of us, Brenda Ferraro and Shella Gentry, we've known each other for how long do you think?
About 1.5 years now, I guess.
Yeah, we met each other through Prevalent, but also you're part of the HISAC, and so we get to talk a bit on those types of things as well. So you don't want to know that much about me. I'm going to turn it over to Shella. Can you give a little bit of a background on your role at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Kansas City and how you lead the program of third-party risk management there?
Yeah, of course. So I've been with Blue Cross and Blue Shield of KC, known also as Blue KC, for about 1.5 years now. I've always done various aspects of risk management. And so when I came to Blue KC, my primary focus has always been on third-party risk. And so that's what I'm doing today.
Big job, big job. All right, so I'm only gonna do tiny bit of sales pitches. I've got one at the beginning and then one at the very, very end. This is all about Shella and Blue KC and how they've evolved in their program. But I did wanna say some exciting news. Recently, we at Prevalent became one of the leaders in the leader quadrant, in the magic quadrant of Gartner. And the reason for that is because our strengths are heavy in the product service, product strategy, and the vertical industry strategy. We have the strongest strategy among all of the dedicated VRM companies in the leader quadrant, and we're delivering on our vision, which was recognized over the past 9 months to get us from a visionary to a leader. So a lot of great things happening, and part of that is because of people like Shella in Blue KC, where they come to us and say, hey, there's some situations that I need some help with. Can we have a strategy discussion and talk about where Prevalent can go in the future from a forward-thinking perspective and see if they're able to just, I guess, take those disconnects and gaps and close them up. So we do that often with Shella. But enough about Prevalent. Let's talk about the agenda. So today we're going to be hearing from Shella about where Blue KC was about 1 year ago, what programmatic improvements they've made, what cross-departmental automation has occurred, and then what measurements they use to enhance their program today. So we'll move forward into the meat of our discussion. And I think, Shella, our first thing that we want to know is, what problem were you trying to solve at Blue KC last year and why?
Yeah, so historically, Blue KC was performing the entire third-party risk management process manually. Everything from the collection of risk tracking to collection of assessments. And it was all done using a series of emails and spreadsheets, which, as you all know, there's a ton of room for error doing that. So the manual processing obviously made it difficult and time consuming to maintain, but additionally share that information. So once the original process had matured, we wanted to increase capacity, of course, to perform those assessments and improve efficiency of processing and communicating associated risks and in regards to vendors.
Okay, great. And so I remember when I was building a program, Manual and spreadsheets was kind of the bane of my existence. I wanted to get rid of them very, very quickly. So I'm glad that you looked at that and you're moving forward into a more automated approach. Let's talk about some of those things. So what kind of program steps did you take related to making the process faster and also staying within compliance and making that a snap?
Sure. So we do utilize Prevalence Managed Services. We get help from the Risk Operations Center, and they help streamline our process. So essentially what happens is we have a notification that comes to us from our procurement department that triggers the ROC team at Prevalent to launch assessments for us. So we don't have to manage that piece of that process. As soon as that assessment is completed, we get notified and we can go in and do our work internally. Before, I think we were averaging around a 60+ day turnaround time before we were utilizing Prevalent's new solution. Now we're averaging 36 days. This is incredible just because for obvious reasons, we've been able to assess vendors much quicker and we're able to track risks in the solution instead of those spreadsheets. If we need to address a risk item, we can communicate with the vendor inside the solution as well, and we can have chaser emails go out to the vendor to remind them that we're still waiting on a response in regard to risk remediation or mitigation, and that's great as well for audit purposes. Back to audit, so compliance, we've identified key controls at BlueKC, and in the solution, we can track those. So when an assessment's complete, we have our key controls lined out, filtered out, and if they're not meeting that, we're aware it's forward-facing, and we can flag those vendors and tell them they're not meeting our key controls and discuss with them appropriately what they can do to mitigate that.
Yeah, I think we're going to be talking about key controls further down in the webinar. It's something that really seemed to help a bunch with being able to focus on what matters most to your risk tolerance and appetite. And the ROC that Shella was talking about, ROC, it stands for our Prevalent Risk Operations Center. So we have resources that are doing the collection administrivia, the chaser email tracking and monitoring, and then verifying that when the content comes back, that the content is readily available to bump up against Shella's pre-configured risks so she knows exactly what she needs to look at. Well, let's look at some of the capabilities within the platform. It is flexible. So do you want to talk about some of those flexibilities that you've realized by automating this portion of your workflow?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I really value with Prevalent is how flexible and configurable the system is, and I can do it myself. So I don't have to rely on Prevalent resources all the time to do something I want to do. For instance, we have predefined risk statuses that we've created, but we've also got statuses to identify where we're at in the process of assessment. So we've set up some roles inside the solution so audit can come in if they want to know if we've assessed a vendor, what that assessment looked like, they can go and view that, and they have specific role types set up for their viewing access only. They can't modify anything in the solution, and defining those roles are all things that I can do myself as well.
And I like the way that how in the entity tree structure, sometimes you might have a vendor or an entity that has multiple engagements, and you have the ability to segregate that information while still using the content that they have given you from a higher level architectural purview. So that's something that was really nice. And then having the ability to also, there's much more flexibility that we have with regards to, we've got risk recommendations that you can have within the solution that's already pre-canned, but you have the ability to say, well, for BlueKC, this is what we're looking for from the vendor, and here's the timeline that we're looking for them to complete it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more down the road. So what specific automation capabilities did you implement that has been very helpful for you?
Yeah, so when dealing with risk items, we have a risk report that we can present to the vendor. And you were talking about remediation and tracking that in this risk report a little bit ago. So in that report, we can outline what our remediation steps are and the timeline that that risk needs to be mitigated for us to move forward with that third party. So this helps us be incredibly transparent with our vendors, and that helps them understand what we need from them to ensure compliance on our side. So some positive tangible impact to our organization. We've cut our assessment turnaround time down by 55%. And that's huge for us because we can think deeper on risk management instead of chasing down those emails to the vendors and collect various artifacts. And so now when we have a risk, we can have a vendor go in if I need them to provide any type of evidence to that risk to validate that they now have that control in place after we've discussed remediation. They can go and upload it directly into the solution. And we can set expiration dates on that document and reminders that the year a SOC 2 is out of date. Vendor, please go update this documentation in our portal. Forward thinking too, it just helps us make better risk-based decisions proactively. Again, talking about breaking down some silos, we have now started utilizing Prevalent's API export capability. And so we are now integrating as well with our enterprise risk management solution to feed risk scores and information to our enterprise risk group.
Yeah, and I think that some of the automation capabilities we're going to talk about in some of the slides moving forward. Here's an example of what survey communication is sent, where it's got a logo for Kansas City. We've used verbiage that you've identified is healthy for the communication between you and the vendor, and then some other notifications that happen. You want to talk about some of these auto-generated notifications that you've pre-configured and set up?
Sure. So whenever the initial trigger email that I spoke about earlier, we call that a member to vendor letter. So that is a email that is sent automatically to a vendor, and it tells them this is our solution that BlueKC uses to manage third-party risk. Register, sign up, and you'll be able to access the portal. So once they fill out that assessment, there are various notifications that go out automatically based on predefined SLAs in our solution. So once that survey is completed, the slide here, the survey notification there on the left, that's the notification we'll get when a survey is ready for BlueKC to review. Now, let's say I have a question for the vendor around a risk item. I'll add a comment into that risk item, and that vendor can go and respond, provide documentation, as I mentioned earlier, various things we can do, but there's a notification that comes with that comment, and you'll see that there on the right.
So many companies will use a solution or a platform to do the workflow, but not the communication between them and the vendor. Are you using the Prevalent platform to contain all of your communications, your documents, your status of everything that's going on with your third-party risk life cycle within the solution, and trying not to go outside of the platform to keep it all in one place?
Yeah, so that's something that is incredibly important to us, because something that a lot of people don't really think about is the continuity of your program. And when we have turnover, sometimes those emails are gone when that person leaves. So we don't know what was going on with that vendor. And so going forward, we really started utilizing the solution to have conversations with that vendor. That way we have a log of what's been happening during the assessment phases.
Great. Well, here I think is part of what you were talking about as part of our program. Here's the email that they would get and having to register, but also some of your pre-canned and pre-configured workflow for the chasers in the event that they don't respond. Do you want to talk about this portion of your workflow here?
Yeah, so we work very heavily with our sourcing department, because they do sourcing and vendor management, honestly. So because they have those relationships with those vendors, we want to make sure that they are aware, especially if it's a new vendor, how quickly they should be filling out this assessment. Because if they don't have an idea of it or an expectation, then they may take 45 plus days to fill out an assessment, but that slows down the process of getting them onboarded into our company. So we have, as you can see on the slide here, we've got the predefined SLAs for how often we check in with that vendor to make sure that they are filling out the assessment. Additionally, it kind of allows them an opportunity as well to reach out to us if they have questions. So maybe they can't log in, we can work through that.
So do you ever see, like, in between the 16 days and the 2-day reminders, where majority of the time those special gentle nudges help them to move along? Or is there anywhere, and maybe you don't know, so I'm just asking this question off the cuff, but is it kind of like after they get the second nudge, they're normally very responsive, or do you find a percentage that you have to escalate internally because they're very unresponsive and you don't get any response at all?
Sure. So normally, once that initial notification goes out to register for the platform, that's when we typically get feedback from the vendor, because we're starting to realize that during the contracting phase, sourcing may not always have the appropriate contact to fill out these assessments. So they'll come back to us notifying us, hey, there's somebody else in our group that would be more appropriate to fill out this assessment. Can we reassign this to so-and-so? And what's great is we can do that very easily, but additionally, let's say they want to make it a group effort, then we can give them education and documentation on how to go and assign the assessment to people in their group themselves. The vendor can also do that themselves.
Yeah, that's one of the great features that I was missing when I had a program. You could only have one person complete the questionnaire. There was no quarterbacking or being able to share it with others so that they can complete their components that they're a subject matter expert in. So that's a very good feature that I'm glad you're taking advantage of. Now, for communication of transparency, it's important for us to be able to say, whether you have a program and you're looking for a finding, or you've got a document that's not substantial or out of date, what are the types of techniques or features that you use within the platform to let them know that there's something to be done either internally or externally?
Yeah, so we assign tasks to vendors when we require additional information around a risk. So we may request a document to be uploaded or ask another question tied to that risk that we've identified. And assigning tasks to that vendor is helpful for us, because if the vendor doesn't respond to the due date, then they'll constantly receive reminder notifications. But additionally, it kind of tells us too, maybe we need to do some more due diligence. Maybe they don't want to respond because their response isn't going to be what we want. But additionally, we use this internally as well. We have internal reviews that we do on vendors that have SOC 2 reports. And this is just another way for us to track that process.
Now, on SOC 2 reports, that's an interesting topic. Some people will say, sometimes a vendor doesn't want to fill out a questionnaire and they just want to give the SOC 2. Is that something that your department has created a practice around that you might be able to share with the community?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up. So it is, we do accept various documents in lieu of the HISAC assessment, because that's what the standardized questionnaire that we're using currently. And when they do that, we have specific statuses set up for those vendors, because that then tells us that there's a policy exception on that vendor, and we have to follow another process internally to make sure we're tracking that appropriately for audit reasons. But something that we are working through right now is actually creating a SOC 2 risk register, so we can report on identified SOC 2 controls that were found in the SOC report. And that's just going to help us overall further mature our program.
That's great. So talking about risk registers, what are some of the risk registers that you have in place today? I know you probably have like an HISAC risk register, but do you have additional ones outside of the SOC one that you're working on as well?
Yeah, so we utilize the HISAC risk register very heavily, because that's where our key controls lie. But we do have another department that is also utilizing Prevalent simultaneously with us, and they have their own risk register. And having those two separate risk registers allows us to report individually by department, but we can also report as an aggregate as well.
And I like the way that, so you talked about breaking down the silos and bringing other departments into your program. With that other department and having the risk register, are they using the same content, or are they supplementing content gathering with things that are important to them to what you've been gathering already on the vendor?
Yeah, great question. So this specific group, it's our Medicare Advantage group. they have an entirely different process than we do. There is overlap in vendors, which is great. So that knowledge share there is so much better than it was because, again, there was so much we didn't know that maybe MA did. And also it's identified areas where we weren't assessing a certain vendor and MA brought it to our attention. So it's been really great in that sense. But going back to that, they have an internal assessment process they have to do as well. So not only are they tracking external assessments on vendors, they're also tracking their internal assessment on that vendor.
Nice. Great. Well, we'll talk about that probably a little bit more. But let's jump into, during your journey, what practices would you recommend to others? And I know we have a couple slides that support this question. So let me know when you want me to bebop over to this key controls, but I think you've got some overall comments first, I would think.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me is a solution is really only going to be as good as your process. So I always advise people to really sit down and think how their process is working, because if you have a messy or inconsistent process, your solution is not going to be the magic you're looking for. I really think folks need to spend time understanding your organization's business and the services that are being provided to you by your third parties. Identifying key controls is definitely a must-have before working with third parties, based, of course, on the scope of work being done. But if you don't have those, it's hard to assess vendors fairly or consistently. Probably consistently is a better word for that. A huge one too is make sure that you're building, a relationship with the business and help them understand risks as it pertains to what they're doing for the organization. Building that relationship is really just going to help you become a part of the conversation before a third party is even onboarded. It's also going to further drive adoption to a risk culture in your group.
So you've been speaking to many different departments to break down the silos, one of them being sourcing. Is there some other ones like architecture or compliance or legal that you've also brought into sharing with them how far you've come and where your program and or the solution can be information that they could also benefit from?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have roughly 8 various business units at Blue KC that we're working with currently. And we all have our own workflow, so to speak, to make sure that we're all looking at the same vendor under the same lens, so to speak. So having those conversations and as you're assessing a vendor is incredibly important, but we're then able to discuss risk from different lenses in terms of privacy, data, you've got business continuity, data architecture, and things of that nature.
So are you using the compliance screens to slice and dice the content for the view for those resources?
Sure. So currently we're not using that compliance feature outside of our own department. What we're doing is we're sharing our information through a risk report, a summary risk report that we generate out of the solution.
Okay, great. We're going to be getting to that. So let's move towards some of the components that you've started using in the practices. So key controls, talk about that. That was a very interesting engagement that we had with the HISAC, where we were using a questionnaire that was the full, which is over 200 and some odd plus questions. And you were part of a committee that looked at important key controls for not only the Blues, but pharmaceuticals and other healthcare constituents.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we do utilize the HISAC assessment. Myself, in collaboration with other HISAC members, developed a light version of that questionnaire. So we took that 240 some questions and narrowed it down to about 47. And that was what we called the key control list of HISAC. So on this slide here, you can see risk categories field within that risk register section in the platform. And that right there enables us to filter on those key controls and easier reporting outside of that.
That's great. And you can always use other questionnaires along with the HISAC Lite. Say if you wanted to do a GDPR supplemental, or if you had New York DFS, or if in the event you find out the responses to that Lite questionnaire, you're able to then expand it to the full if you wanted to, correct? That's what your approach is?
Absolutely.
Now for risk recommendations, this was one of my favorites, and I love talking about it because oftentimes within my program, when I had resources doing third-party risk, they would have a document over to the left or the right. And if there was a risk, they would go and look at this document on the outside of the solution, and they would find out what the risk recommendation was. And if that wasn't available, then every assessor would have their own voice typing in exactly what was expected for that risk to be resolved or mitigated, or to ask questions. So it looks like what you've started doing is pre-programming and configuring those risk recommendations to be one voice. So no matter who's doing the assessment or who's getting the information in a summary report, that information is canned and readily available, but can be adjusted with justification, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are situations where we do meet with the business owner, the sourcing specialist, and the vendor to go through these risk items one by one. And in this instance, you're absolutely right. We do have predefined risk mitigation recommendations in here, depending on what the risk is. And as we're addressing this with the vendor, they can see what that predefined recommendation is in the risk report. But if there's some tweaking that needs to be done, we can go in and adjust that as we need to. I'm looking at the screenshot here. So something too is changing that estimated time to complete that risk mitigation is something that we modify quite a bit, which is very helpful.
Yeah, we had to do that as well. We'd have like 30, 60, 90, and sometimes 1-year plans. And depending on what the risk was, we could at least default to something and then make an adjustment according to however long it took us to do it was going to take them that long to do as well. So we didn't want to set expectations that were too far off from reality. Now, you've talked a little bit about the risk review summary report and how you use it. Some people use it just to populate into their GRC platform. Some people use it to give to the business. What's your technique and the usage reasons for the risk summary report?
Sure. So I am someone who believes in full transparency. So this is absolutely what we provide to our internal stakeholders and the vendor. It's just an efficient way for us to communicate those risks and recommendations on risk mitigation. And it's easier for us to provide this to them because it helps drive that discussion and discuss those timelines with the vendor, and also get a better understanding of, sometimes it's more clarity actually, because we may identify a risk, and when we address this with the vendor, they say, oh, I didn't understand the question. And we can go back through and work through it through those discussions.
Right.
But, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying, right, that's a good idea.
And so what we end up doing with this is we have stages that we provide these risk reviews. So we have an initial risk report that comes out, and then there's sometimes an interim whenever we're working with a vendor to do mitigation. And then if for some reason they can't mitigate right away, or there's additional steps or controls that need to be put in place by the vendor, we have a policy exception process that, and a risk acceptance process that we go through with the business owner. And that will end up being the final risk report that they see. And then it's easier for them, the business owner, to understand the items that we will be tracking with that vendor as they work through mitigation.
So one of the things that I like about your program procedure, I guess you could call it, is that you give them something initially to say, here's what we identified, without having a discussion. And then it sounds like in the interim, if you do have a discussion or you make some changes, find compensating controls, you update it, and you're keeping all of these in your documentation records for audit, correct?
Absolutely.
And then you've got the final probably risk review summary report. And then when someone mitigates a risk, do you end up resubmitting or reconfiguring the summary report and keeping that as it's evolving over time?
Yeah, so I guess the best way for me to explain that would be, let's say we're assessing a vendor, and initially we've identified 10 risks. The vendor sees this and they go, oh, 3 of these are not really risks, here's why. And we discuss it, review, and we go, okay, so now we're down to 7. And then it's, all right, let's meet with this vendor, have this discussion, and then let's say they get rid of 5 more, and now we only have 2. So those two would then remain on that review, risk review summary report only, just because it's, hey, business owner, this is what we will be tracking through until mitigation or remediation happens. And we have all three of those documents, so you can follow that stepping stone process.
Are you creating tasks as well for those final items for them to have, just to make it so that they have a portal, they can see they have an unfavorable response for the items after they're done submitting their questionnaire, or you're looking at maybe their threat intelligence, you're giving them this report to say, here's the remediation requirements, you've negotiated timelines. So do you also create tasks just to keep it in front of them with the reminders?
Absolutely. So on those task items, that will, for us, those are not closed out until a review is done and we can validate that the control that they're stating they now have in place is actually in place. So what happens is, on this risk review summary report, we have that ETA of when that control, or that when that risk is supposed to be remediated by. If it's not, they receive chaser emails, reminders that, hey, this is 10 days overdue, or whatever you want to define as an SLA. And then what's also interesting, and I'm anticipating us having this issue, is many people know that contacts at the vendors, they change all the time. So whenever we assign these tasks and say that initial contact leaves, and let's say they were supposed to have a control in place by October 1st of 2020, well, somebody new comes on board and they go, oh, well, I'm not going to get this to you until April of 2021. And you say, well, I had a discussion previously with you guys and it was supposed to be in place by October 1st. Can you explain why? Here is our conversation that we had about this in the solution. And the vendor has complete and total access to view that log as well.
Nice. Do you share information with your auditors using the platform, or do you have like a user role that you give to them where they can view only?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a role set up for audit, sourcing, and procurement. We also have roles that obviously set up for us, and we have roles set up for our enterprise risk management team as well.
Good. So about having view and visibility, how do you measure your program progress? You've done so many interesting things over the year to reduce timelines to 50%, understanding when COVID happens, elevating the timelines and the exception for the emails so that they're not getting reminders based on pre-COVID time. What program measurements do you use to validate what you're doing is the right thing?
Sure. So metrics are incredibly important, and that is absolutely how we measure our program progress. Currently, we track vendor assessment turnaround time, and before COVID, we were setting a SLA of 30 days. And empathetically, when COVID hit, we extended that to 45 days, just because, I think people really had to take time to get used to this new normal of working remotely, and also just a lot of families and not having as much time to devote to these third-party risk assessments because of their new surroundings. But on top of that, we're also, of course, measuring top vendor risks, number of third parties by risk ranking, and also vendors not completing our assessments.
And is all of that information coming out of the platform, or you can see it and visibly create reports through the platform, or do you have a technique that's a little bit internally and externally, or what do you do for that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a hybrid approach right now. I know that Prevalent is getting ready to release some enhanced reporting capabilities as far as us being able to measure the turnaround time in the solution itself. So that is something we are doing manually in the spreadsheet right now. But outside of that, the risks, number of third parties by risk, and of course, who is not completing our assessments is all done in the solution.
Yes, you are accurate. Prevalent is diligently working. We may have released it, or it's coming in the next one where we won't have to do that externally. So this is one of those other salesy type slides, and it's basically showing you the intelligence from every corner, where Blue KC has taken advantage of many of these things, such as the industry partnership. Down below, she is part of the HISAC as a member, and she's taking advantage of the shared services and the HISAC light and full questionnaire. She's also part of the work group, I believe, and you talk about things of enhancements that will help the healthcare community. But inclusive of that, she's part of our peer-to-peer strategy group within Prevalent that talks about techniques that she has in place. She's getting ready to start using our vendor threat monitoring feed, which is going to give her the outside in view along with the inside out. And I don't want to take away from what things you're going to be doing in the future. So I'll stop talking about what Blue KC is thinking about doing, but show to everyone that there's completed assessments in our networks. We have technology integrations. We're regulatory monitoring with registers so that other departments have the ability to slice and dice the information that's stored, whether intel or questionnaire responses or risk information. And that's all harmonized and normalized so that you can do everything in a one-stop shop, even when partnering or complementary with GRC tools or IRM tools, and then sourcing tools as well. Because procurement seems to be some of the organizations that are heavily looking at, how do I know these vendors' security posture or even their business resiliency posture before I start doing selection? So go ahead and go out to Prevalent at your own convenience and look at all the capabilities or set up a demo. But let's get into the key takeaways from today, Shella, that you would hope that people would walk away with before we get into one last slide and then Q&A.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, everyone in the organization wants to be compliant. Your vendors want to be compliant with what you need in security. The big thing though is, again, building those relationships outside of your own business unit. So for us, building the relationship with the business owners and sourcing and procurement is such a big part of our program. We have to engage with them and let them be a part of those risk conversations, because the more you educate them, the more they understand. And it's incredibly important. So again, sourcing, my gosh, I couldn't talk about them all day, but they hold so much knowledge on vendors that you can leverage. And for us, they've just been really great in brokering conversations with the business to have these risk discussions. And the relationships our team has built has really brought third-party risk to the forefront of the organization.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Procurement seems to have they're like the front door to having the vendors come and work. And so you'll want to know what kind of heavy lift you're going to have before you start working with them as they've been selected. So it's good to share information. Did you find any barriers with having conversations with them? Did they feel a little bit like, I already have a tool, I don't need any more information thrown at me? Or how did you help them to learn about the value add?
Yeah, so I think initially some of it is a little overwhelming for them, but what has been great for us is during our maturing of the last year, now when a vendor is being onboarded and sourcing understands the scope of the work being done, they know what questions to ask the business up front before they even come to us, which to me has been incredibly helpful because then we get to understand the service a little bit better. Because sometimes there is that gap in communication of what's happening, how are they getting data from us? And if they are they storing it? What does that look like? And for sourcing to understand the scope of work and how that could impact risk to the business has been huge.
Good. Well, we've talked a little bit or a couple times about the healthcare network and the value to the members, and just a little plug and shout out to the HISAC. Here is some links and some things that you can go to in efforts that if you are in the healthcare space and you want to become a member, it doesn't mean that all of our discussion topics don't float over into other industries like retail and finance. There's standards that we have for all of those, but specifically if you're interested in either becoming a member of HISAC or learning more about the shared services where Prevalent helps, you can go to their website at h-isac.org, go into membership, and then there's a how to join, and there's also a third-party risk management shared services section for you. So thanks to the HISAC for all of their help in getting us to where we are. But let's now focus on Q&A. It looks like we might have some things, Amanda, plus a polling question.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
got a good amount of time, maybe like 20
thank
minutes
goodness.
or so.
This was a hot commodity webinar, let me tell you. We have a ton of questions. I'm putting the poll question up right now, everybody. We want to know if you're looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the next several months. Answer honestly, because I'm going to tell you right now, I'm the one that's going to be reaching out to you. So don't get hot and bothered if you don't want me to message you, because it's going to come from me.
But
So
you're famous now, because this is your TV show.
I'm Miss Prevalent. Okay, so let's cut right to it. I'm gonna give you the questions in the order that they were received out of respect for people. So the first one we had was, what was again the timeline for reviewing / assessing vendors before and after utilizing Prevalent?
Yeah, so to make sure I'm answering what you're asking, it took about a little over, I think it was 62 days for a vendor even to just respond to our assessment. So couple that with about a week, and I would say, almost 75 days.
And so they probably want to know what you reduced it down to would be the next question, Shella.
Yeah.
So if
Sorry
you want to
about
repeat that.
Yep, so now we are sitting at 36 days, and it probably takes us 4 days. I think it's a little over 4 days to do those assessments, the initial assessment, because there is some give and take. So sorry, I'm getting into like my metric head a little bit. So I would say roughly overall 43 to 44 days.
And are you saying that is from the date that you contact the vendor with the, hey, welcome to our program, to register, to they enter their information, to the risk operations center does their verification? It's that long of amount of time from start to finish of the administrivia in order for you to start doing your proper risk identification applicable to Blue KC?
So then this is just me speaking. I am very quick to assess a vendor as soon as I get that notification. I do multiple simultaneously. And so what has really been helpful, and let me make sure I'm clarifying, that 43 to 44 turnaround time is from the vendor filling out that assessment to me completely sending out my final risk summary review.
Good, awesome.
Yeah, so it's pretty quick in my opinion, because we can track risk conversations with the vendor inside that solution. That has been really big. It just cuts down a little bit on email, and as silly as it sounds, I know that they get an email notification to go in and do this, but nonetheless, I don't have to go and bug them or knock on their door, so to speak, to follow up with me on some risk items.
Nice.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, the next one I have is, they're extremely curious on strategies to address third-party risk assessments before procurement and subsequent periodic updates.
So I think the way that I'm taking that question, and hopefully I'm on the right path, is there's a couple different ways that you can identify some supportive content and information for procurement before they go down a certain direction. The first thing is get what you can in your hands very rapidly so that you have at least a sneak peek into what their posture is. And in doing that, you can use threat intelligence. Vendor threat monitoring is one of those. Some other people use other situations or tools, but do an outside look in just to say, here's what's happening out in the wild, and here are the risks that you're going to have. The other thing is you can use profiling questionnaires or tiering questionnaires of about 5 to maybe less than 12 questions that tell you if they're doing services or providing product from regions, or if they're data handlers, or if they have to be compliant with a specific type of regulatory requirement. You can also look at financial data, but I would say that those are the two approaches. And then one thing that we're running into, maybe not at Blue KC, but other organizations, is if you don't have point of contacts, you should be able to at least go internally to your business to find out who they've been speaking with. Or if you do have the point of contacts, you should be able to go out and go directly to the vendor if there's no one in the business unit that unfortunately doesn't take the control or the authority to own those risks. So those are the things that I would say. Shella, what are your points on that?
Yeah, so this is something we did as a collaboration. And so we have what's called an intake form, which essentially stratifies our vendors. So we built this form with data privacy, our audit group, compliance, obviously information security, business continuity, enterprise risk. We all came together and we said, okay, what questions do we need to know upfront about this vendor so we can stratify them or tier them appropriately? And that's how we do it. We do manage that process in another solution, which is our ERM solution that we use our API to connect to later.
Nice, good strategies.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so the next one that I have here is, oh, my screen just kind of crapped out on me. All right, I have to skip one. But the next one is, how do you handle the I'm not doing this vendors?
Yeah, fun question. So I think everyone can probably agree with the fact that you're going to get some larger organizations that just are not going to take the time to fill out your assessments. So Microsoft to be one. And truthfully, we do mark those as an exception to our policy, just so we're tracking that from a compliance standpoint. But we do go out and proactively pool their SOC 2s. Any other attestations we can grab, we'll just go and proactively get that information just so we can prove that we are trying to work through our process. Additionally, there's vendors as well that want to provide their SIG or some other type of standardized assessment. And we will accept some of them. We do ask for the business approval before we accept those. And when we do, we have a process that we use through Prevalent. We'll still tell the vendor, hey, we're going to send you this little survey and I need you to respond that you do not want to fill out our assessment and here's what you want to use instead. So that way we can track that alternate substitution that way.
And what I've seen used in the past or even today is some people will say, we'll accept your SIG, for example, and then if the HISAC is their primary questionnaire that they want to use, they'll say, we'll accept it in lieu of you finishing this and we'll give you extra time to finish it. And then they'll identify risks by using their questionnaire that they've provided. The other thing is with the SOC 2s or maybe high trust or certifications, I see people taking those as a supplemental or a in lieu of, and then creating risks within the system to make sure that everything's tracked in one place for the KPIs and KRIs. So those are the couple of the things that I've also seen used as well.
Perfect. This one is for Shella. Is your sourcing department using Prevalent for their own assessments? For example, financial viability, reputational privacy risks?
They're not. So they use their own solution. But what's been really awesome is now that we have started utilizing the continuous monitoring piece of Prevalent, they're interested in this. So they like to go out and look at the business monitoring segment of that module, if you will. And I think that there's going to be some usage from them in the future on that.
For sure. And we're constantly coming up with new ways, you know, so that's exciting. Next one is how well have vendors accepted their new process of responding to requests in the Prevalent tool? Any obstacles such as wanting a tri-party NDA between vendors, BCBS and Prevalent?
Yep, so great question. Initially, so there are two ways you can communicate with a vendor in the solution. There is a chat box, and you can literally think of it like an iPhone messaging. So you have the little blue box, and you have the little gray box when they respond. And we started down the path of communication that way first in the chat box. And I was realizing that we weren't getting the responses as quickly as I would like. And so when we realized that, hey, if we assign tasks to them and set deadlines, they're going to get these chaser emails. It's going to remind them to come and respond to us. So that was kind of a learning point for us, and that has been great. And I haven't had any negative feedback on that. I've actually had quite a few vendors comment on how much easier it is to do that because they can take it at their own pace sometimes. And then, yes, so we have had not a ton, but maybe a handful of vendors here in the last quarter or so that have asked for NDAs, not between the three of us, but for Prevalent to sign an NDA with them.
Makes sense. Next question. How many vendors do you have versus risk analysts?
I love that question. So I am a party of one. And I say that I do have a counterpart, but I do have my counterpart focusing primarily on internal assessments in regards to SOC 2 reports and high trust certifications, and validating that what is provided is in scope for the services being provided by that vendor. So I've assessed personally this year about 175 vendors.
Wow. Love it. Okay, next question. Hello, can you please advise 5 key risks / areas we have to consider for auditing TPRM program at enterprise level?
So it's maybe a little tough. So we have a third-party risk management policy. So the way our auditing process works, we have risk statements inside that policy, and it basically outlines how we manage our program. Our auditing group will literally go step by step and check our process that way. I would make sure, number one, that if that vendor has a SOC 2, you get it, because audit will ask for it. That's been my experience forever. And also, you can't just accept it, you need to review it. And you need to make sure that if there's something that wasn't kosher in that report, that you are alerting the business and they're aware of that. Because it's kind of interesting, the conversations that come out of those SOC reports when you're reviewing them with the business.
So that actually leads me to the next question. How important is it to review SOC 1 reports from vendors, or what is the risk if you do not review SOC 1 reports as part of a TPRM audit? So you kind of answered that already, but maybe just shine a little bit more light of like the severity of.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify too, I do not review SOC 1. We have another group that performs those reviews, but we do look at SOC 2 because we are information security. So we want to look at their security controls, of course. So again, incredibly important, because additionally, when you, depending on the assessment that you're using for your vendor, you can do some compare and contrast. So we've caught some contradictory responses in the assessment compared to what their SOC says. Sometimes it's good, a contradiction, sometimes it's bad. But it also provides us additional clarity because it's an external assessor going into that vendor's environment. So I rely very heavily on those reviews.
And I think from a SOC 1 perspective, with it really focusing on the financial, procurement normally asks for that, or the sourcing organizations, because they're looking to see how they vet towards an overall company perspective, whereas the SOC 2 or the SOC 2 Plus has more security components, OT and IT within it.
Next question is your third-party risk assessment a requirement of vendors being onboarded? How do you ensure that all vendors are assessed?
Absolutely. So we do assess vendors a little bit differently depending on the type of data they're receiving from us. So that being said, it is very much known knowledge that before a vendor can get our data or come into our environment, they have to undergo these reviews. There's a multitude of reviews that happen before a vendor can get onboarded. And if for some reason there is a VP who really needs to move quickly on a vendor, there is a exception process that is followed. And so to speak, we actually we are using Prevalent's continuous monitoring module to do the quick analysis if we need to move quickly on that vendor.
Awesome. Next one is, could you please further explain how you handle policy exception process with vendors?
Yeah, so the way that we are also a ServiceNow shop, and that is where we manage all of our policy exceptions. And I'm trying to think of what example I want to use. So in terms of an open risk item, so to speak, we have it logged as an open risk item in the solution, and then we have to go into ServiceNow. We'll create our policy exception in there, but then additionally, we will add that policy exception record into the solution so we can track it there for our knowledge. And again, if I were to ever leave, someone has that data in there, they know to go look at the policy exception through ServiceNow. I hope that answered your question.
So I think it does. The other portion is if you have a steering committee where you can elevate anything that's of an unfavorable, whether the vendor is not responsive or there's a risk that hasn't been mitigated, or if you're finding that there's a a breach that's not being attended to, you can always elevate those types of scenarios to a steering committee or go through a workflow, a sign off on if it's acceptable or not, to either disposition it as something you're going to live with or something that you need to take care of. So that happens sometimes as well. Shella, do you have a steering committee that you elevate escalations to?
Yep, so we have a vendor management oversight committee that we work heavily with, and it's made up of people from various business units within Blue KC, everyone, as I mentioned earlier, so ERM, compliance, data privacy.
Good.
Okay, next question is, well, we already answered that actually. It's the same thing, the same question about SOC. The final question is, could you please suggest any other TPRM metrics that can be used for board reporting? You mentioned turnaround and number of vendors by risk.
Yeah, so a big one that I actually didn't mention, now that I'm kind of surprised I didn't, is showing that variance of open risk to remediated. That is really big, and that is something we do report on to the VMOC quarterly, because they want to make sure that we are making progress with our vendors to minimize risk for our organization.
Yeah, and you use the risk summary report content and filter that out from a hierarchical perspective, maybe from a portfolio perspective, I would imagine, using that data on how to show who are our top riskiest vendors, what is our deviation between risks identified and risks mitigated. Are you using probably here's where our risk is by security domain or operational domain?
Yeah, so operational for us. So we have all of our vendors assigned to, for lack of better terms, like product lines, and we report using operational terms. That way it's a little bit easier for the business to understand as well.
Nice.
And one last question, ladies. This is going to be for Brenda. Does the Prevalent platform have the ability to use a tier or categorization approach to request relevant content for review?
Yes, Blue KC isn't using all of the features as of yet. We'll cross our fingers and hope they do. But with an intake form or a profiling or a stratification form, we can set up auto-generated rules that will use a tiering or a category approach. And with that, you can apply what due diligence needs to be sent out to the vendor, whether it be one or multiple questionnaires based on the engagement level. So say, for example, your tier 1, which would be your highest critical risk third parties or vendors, you'll probably want to send them additional information that you're trying to capture. Whereas if it was tier 3, they might have a lighter approach. So the platform has the ability not only to tier, not only to categorize, but also set up some auto-generated capabilities so that when you get the information of how it applies to your tiering approach, what type of a package needs to be sent to that vendor so that they're answering relevant information versus everything in the kitchen sink.
Perfect. All right, ladies. Well, that is all we have today. I wanted to thank you guys for attending. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to email us at info@prevalent.net. Other than that, until next time, thank you both again, Brenda and Shella. It was a pleasure. It was my first time.
You did great. Shella, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your wealth of knowledge. We really appreciate it.
Definitely. All right. Thanks, everyone. Until next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.